Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Makari Guides of Warframe, noob-friendly stuff. Welcome! Today we're going to be looking at the delights of Saryn, the mistress of miasma, the death-dealing demonic babe of justice. This is a very, very powerful frame. And as a quick disclaimer, these guides are nothing more than my personal experience of the frame with a bit of research put in. These guides are the basics. They're not going to be looking at too much in depth with them. They are a generalization with general builds, general playstyles, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you want some basics, this is going to be for you. Now, as a fundamental, Saryn's passive is to extend status duration more than her passive is that she extends any status duration quite substantially. So we're going to take a look at her abilities first. The first ability you're going to be looking at is Spores. Now, in terms of how her abilities work, her builds are going to change quite dramatically based on the builds you go for. And we'll look at these builds individually later. However, let's just break down the abilities first. So Spore is one of your fundamental abilities. Spore, when cast, will apply a spore onto an enemy target. This spore will start dealing damage over time and start giving you a stacking buff. It'll give you a stack that will start stacking in the bottom right of your screen. The higher this stack becomes, the more damage your spores do. Initially, your spores will deal corrosive damage over time, and when these explode, they deal a small radial amount of damage to the target and any target around them, and any target within range will then be affected by these spores as well, thus spreading the spores, and giving you more targets to increase your stacks with. Now, the effective range of the spores is increased by your ability range, and the damage and status chance of these spores is affected by your power strength. This works in conjunction with a couple of your abilities and can be really, really potent at high level. Because this is stacking indefinitely, you're going to be able to take this to a very high level. And this was actually made possible by a rework done to Saryn months ago. Saryn used to be a frame that never really stuck out at high level, that was always good at low level. But since her rework, she's really come into her own in terms of overall potency. Moving on, you have her Molt, which is sort of like a decoy. When you activate your Molt, you leave a clone of yourself behind, which enemies will then target and shoot at. This clone will have health and energy based on the way you mod, and when it explodes, it will also deal a radial amount of toxin damage, which can be affected by overall power strength. And the lifespan is also affected by duration, so the more duration you mod for, the longer it'll last, and I believe you can explode it again by using your 2 again. Now, this is sort of like a get out of jail free card because it also allows you to gain a speed boost once it wears off, which is really, really useful. It works again in conjunction with some of your abilities, but it's something that doesn't really tie in too well either. It's just a nice little thing to have as a utility. Moving on, you have one of her very potent abilities called Toxic Lash. Toxic Lash is a buff that is applied to any weapon equipped at the time, which gives that weapon toxin damage, and in turn, this can work in conjunction with the weapon itself. If you have an elemental weapon equipped, not only will you then gain the fire damage, but it'll mix with the current element, giving you the resulting mix. So, for example, if you have a fire weapon, such as Ignis, you then start dealing gas damage. And the power buff this gives to your weapon is based on your power strength. So, and it also then lasts longer with more duration. So it's a very potent ability that you can use in conjunction with certain weapons. Then you have her Miasma. The Miasma is a wide range AoE attack that will deal viral damage and leave a very powerful dot on the enemy based on your power strength, and the radius is also affected by your range. This, when combined with spore spreading, will cause you to deal an absurd amount of damage, and this can also then help you to pop spores as well, not directly, but when the enemy dies, when you deal damage to the spores spread, you deal more damage because of that, so forth, so on. Miasma also then gives a slight stun as well, which is quite useful. And that's sort of like the summary of her abilities. Now, these will work in conjunction with with each other, and we're going to give this a quick demonstration now as to how they work. So let's just summon some dudes here a second. So let's take a look at her 1 first. So the 1 is her spores. You cast a spore on a target, and the spores will start ticking away, as you can see. Now, these spores will start building up a stack in the bottom right, as I mentioned a second ago. The more targets affected by the spores, the quicker this buff goes up. And as you can see, the target is starting to get hit harder and harder as this buff goes up. Now, what I can do is if I hit one of these spores, the spore will then spread to nearby targets that are within the range. The more range you build for, the more likely a target is to get hit. And this can work as a chain reaction. If you mod for enough range, so long as the target is within your line of sight, the target will then get affected by the spores. The more range you have, the more likely are more targets to be affected. And then that can work in conjunction, so you can equip one of your ranged weapons, shoot the spores from a distance, and the spores, if they pop, will then start spreading further and further. You can see they're all the way around there now. And obviously, with that as well, you can then use your 4, start dealing more damage. The damage really starts ramping up as these attacks go off. So as you can see, these guys that have been affected by the spores later are now taking chunks and chunks of damage. The spores, if you run out, if you lose all your spores entirely, then you get something called decaying. As you can see, that buff goes down tremendously quickly. So that's the spore. I'm going to summon a couple of other dudes just to show you the other abilities now. You also saw how her miasma works, where it affects targets in a range. It's nothing too tremendous. The miasma is basically a direct AoE ability that can be just beneficial whilst you're using other abilities. Now, your Molt is a lovely clone of yourself, very handsome looking, that enemies will start attacking when it's spawned, and also gives you a slight speed boost when it's spawned as well. Just gonna move away from these targets a second. Let's get to case in point. You can also cast this as many times as you want, and it is a very good get out of jail free card, because it does give you the ability of getting out of a situation that would otherwise be quite deadly. And any target within range of this as well does take a small amount of ticking damage, so it's another thing that can really add to the power of your frame. Now, your other ability, which is your 3, is Toxic Lash. Any ability that is affected by when Toxic Lash is activated, any weapon you have equipped is then going to start dealing toxin damage. So then that will add to the overall potency of your AoE going out. Now, if you have a weapon that has natural elemental damage already, for example, the Ignis will, instead of dealing fire damage, will now start dealing gas damage, which is incredibly powerful against most targets, and it then adds the damage of the Toxic Lash as well, so not only will you just deal the initial damage of the weapon itself, but it'll start dealing the toxic damage, the power buff of the gas damage as well, or the Toxic Lash even. So that's the individual abilities themselves. There are a couple of augments that can change the way that Saryn plays fundamentally. However, none of them are what I would call mandatory. Now, Venom Dose is one of her augments. This is a sort of like a utility augment that when cast on allies, when you cast your spores on allies, will add 100% corrosive damage to their attacks. So it's like giving your teammates your Toxic Lash, but instead of toxin damage, you're dealing corrosive damage instead. It's a very useful thing to have. You can use it should you wish to. It's a nice thing to put into maybe a late game play if you're fighting Grineer targets. Then you have Regenerative Molt, another really super useful ability for survivability. After casting Molt, Saryn regenerates 50 health per every second for 10 seconds. Really quite nice, very straightforward, very simple to understand. Then you have Contagion Cloud. This is probably the one I wouldn't recommend using. It doesn't scale tremendously well, but it's something that can affect you, give you some nice effects as well. Create 2-meter toxic clouds, dealing 150 toxin damage for 12 seconds with every kill. Damage is twice as strong for melee kills. So there is some potency to this, but I wouldn't really recommend getting rid of mods just in place of that. So it's kind of up to you as to what you do with that. We're just sort of bringing you the attention to them. Now, where you put these mods in is entirely up to you. I would most certainly say that Saryn's Molt, the Regenerative Molt, is most certainly useful for long runs of survival things like Elite Sanctuary, or if you're doing like really long defense missions. Whereas the Corrosive one is good if you're in a pickup group where people may not have corrosive projection. The Toxin Cloud one, it's good, especially at lower levels, and will work quite nicely if you have a team that are set up for it, but, you know, this is for you to find out what works for you. Now, in terms of general builds without augments, Saryn is a very diverse frame. I could have 6 different Saryns, all of which having 3 different builds each, and I wouldn't have enough Saryns to have enough builds to cover all the elements I'd want to. Because each of her abilities can change so diversely based on your build. As I've already briefly gone over, Saryn's 1 is so heavily based off of range, and these builds I'm going to show you now are more so inclined towards her spores and the base way of playing her. You can be very, very playful with what you do with her, and some of these builds will change based on the map, based on the team you're with, and based on how you want to play. So, if you're looking at a generalized spore build, this build right here is pretty decent. This is a glass cannon build. This maximizes your range potential so that you can affect as many targets as possible with your spores. So if you're on an open map and there's lots of open space, or there's lots of areas for you to chain the spores to, this will work perfectly. You are very squishy with this, and you could potentially use Regenerative Molt, or maybe replace Intensify or Energy Conversion with a Survivability mod. But this is entirely up to your prerogative. Something to bear in mind, if you have multiple Saryns in the group, the Saryn that will take priority on spores on a target is the one with the most power strength. So if you mod for a little bit of extra power strength with another Saryn, then you're going to take priority on the damage. But it's not absolutely mandatory, but you do have to bear in mind that with multiple Saryns in the group, you're sort of fighting for damage at that point, which is kind of annoying. Just a little tidbit to know, I've had this happen to me multiple times in Elite Sanctuary, and it's been very, very frustrating to deal with. So, in terms of the build, this one is purely based on a range to spread the spores as quickly as possible, which then gives a good use of your miasma as well. A little bit of power strength to up the overall damage and the status chance. But then you can change things around, where you add survivability, you get rid of some range, you make yourself a lot more condensed around yourself, and this will keep you alive a lot longer. This is also a very basic build as well. You can sort of run how you wish with this. This sort of focuses more on going for a later gameplay, like if you're doing Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. This will be very beneficial for you. As for the augments you use, it is entirely preferential as to how you want to play. Arcane Energize is extremely useful for regenerating energy at all times. There's no specific arcanes that I would recommend here. Arcane Guardian's always good. Arcane Strike's always good. Especially if you're seeing as you're going to be using your melee weapon to try and break the spores, or your ranged weapon, you could always replace that with Arcane Acceleration potentially. But then we move on to builds that are going to be for the other playstyle. This has obviously been very much based around the miasma and the spores. Now, in terms of your Toxic Lash, you want to focus on as much power strength as possible. The more power strength you have, the harder your Toxic Lash is going to... Sorry, the bigger buff you're going to gain from your Toxic Lash. And also, if you do get enemies within range to be able to spread some spores as well, you can then have those spores be super powerful. This is the thing, no matter how you play Saryn, all of her other abilities, so if you specialize with Toxic Lash, her other abilities are still going to have potency. It's just they might not be as important in your rotation as normal. So Toxic Lash is very good for passive play, where you're focusing more on using your weapons rather than using abilities. So you want to put some duration on there just to keep it up as long as possible, and then have as much power strength to get the biggest buff possible. This, again, can be a very basic build. You can just get Intensify on there, maybe Augur Secrets if you have it. You don't need much efficiency because you're going to be casting very infrequently. So you can also replace things like Energy Conversion or a bit of Duration to have some more survivability as well. And each one of these builds that I've mentioned can have any number of their mods changed out to fit different situations. Hence, I mentioned a second ago, you can have 7 different Saryns with multiple different builds. It's crazy to think how many builds you could have with Saryn to fit different situations and how you want to play. But we'll put Saryn into a bit of a demonstration now as to how she works. So we'll go back out to fight. I think we'll clear these guys away. We'll show you this against slightly less aggressive targets. So just kill these guys off so I can get out of here. We don't want you no more. And simulate. So let's just show you what the survivability build is going to do for you. I do believe I had that equipped, don't I? Nope. There we go. So the general playstyle is going to be as such. First of all, you're going to want to put your spores on a target initially, like so. You can also start by making sure you have your Toxic Lash equipped. You can see that Saryn is very heavy on the energy usage, so it's always worthwhile to make sure that you may have energy plates, or at least have Arcane Energize, or something to keep your energy topped off. Which is why if you're going for a very caster heavy, efficiency can be very useful. But once your spores get going, so get the spores going, the spores will be flying, you'll be getting those spores off on the targets. I probably should have actually set them going, but you can see already that these guys are already taking the damage. You can then start dealing damage through the gas damage you would deal from having the Toxic Lash equipped. Let's just go up here and grab... let's turn the AI on so we can get them to being a bit more aggressive. So, we would go into an enemy foray. We'd engage with R1, activate the 2 to have a bit of speed boost. We'd go and find the target affected by the spores. We'd get those spores spreading. Keep those spores spreading, staying passive against them, and then you can start picking them off as they go. Make sure the spores are stacking as much as possible. If you feel like you want to have a bit of a stun to get a bit of room for yourself, you activate your 4 to stun the enemies. That then also gives them more dots going around them. And as you can see, they're sort of stood still whilst they're ticking to death. And as the spores stack higher and higher, that damage is ramping up faster and faster. So you can play very passively with Saryn if you wish. You can play very aggressively if you wish. But there's a lot of depth to her. You can take the depth as far as you want, but even at a basic level, you're going to get a huge amount of potency from Saryn. Absolutely amazing in terms of damage potential. So I hope this guide has been somewhat informative. If you want more information about this, there'll be a link to Saryn's wiki page in the description. There is a lot of information, especially on the spores. I would highly recommend, if you have to read anything about Saryn, check out the information on the spores, because there's a lot of different ways you can spread the spores. There's a lot of different ways that her other abilities can then affect that as well. But if you have enjoyed the video, leave a like, share it to your friends, tell your family and everyone else you know. And if you want to check out the Twitch stream as well, there'll be linked down in the description. And I'll see all you top hatters in the next episode. Ta-ra!